Welcome, friends. This is Economic Update, a weekly analysis of major economic events and trends, the forces, both national and global, that shape our jobs, our incomes, our taxes, our debts, really what we pay, what we buy, how we stand in the economic dimensions of our lives. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I've been a professor of economics all my life at several universities. Currently, I teach in the graduate program for international affairs of the New School University in New York City. I also write columns of economic analysis for the website truthout.org, an independent and courageous source of daily news and analysis. Check them out at truthout.org. If you are interested in the analyses and the discussions, the documents that are referred to in these programs, please know that you can get much more of this kind of analysis by going to either of the two websites that we maintain. They are available to you free of charge, 24 hours a day. The first one is rdwolff.com, and the second one is democracyatwork.info. Both of them are sources of information, sources of analysis. I think you will find them of interest. And they also make available to you signing up for our free newsletter that will also bring this kind of analysis to you through the Internet. Finally, I want to encourage you to continue as you have been doing, sending me your comments, your questions, your thoughts about the program. We select one or two to be responded to on each program, but we also use all of them, and they're all read, to help shape what we cover, how we cover it, in this program. It's a way for you to become part of the community that produces these weekly programs. And again, you can reach me by email through either of those two websites, rdwolff.com or democracyatwork.info. Let me turn then to our shorter updates for this program. I want to begin by noting that over the last week or so, two major newspapers in the United States got sold. And they got sold in a way that raises a basic problem that we all ought to think about. In the first case, the Boston Globe, the premier newspaper in the entire New England region of the United States, was sold to a billionaire by the name of John Henry, whose most distinguishing characteristic, according to the media, is the fact that he is the owner of the Boston Red Sox baseball team. What exactly that has to do with running a newspaper, I will leave to your imagination. I'm not capable of figuring out why that's reasonable. In the second example, even more stark, the leading newspaper in the nation's capital, the Washington Post, was purchased by Jeffrey Bezos, the head of the Amazon Corporation, a corporation whose major activity is being a warehouse that collects goods and services and ships them to people who order them. Used to be book company, now it's a company that ships everything. What exactly a warehouse operator is doing, running the premier newspaper in the nation's capital, is again an act of imagination. But it doesn't stop there. The billionaire Warren Buffett spent $342 million over recent years buying no less than 80 newspapers across the United States, including the Omaha, Nebraska World Herald. And finally, IBT Media recently bought Newsweek magazine. Well, billionaires buying newspapers, what does that suggest? Well, we know that billionaires are obviously economically successful because that's why they're called billionaires. And we know that they have been spending huge amounts of money controlling the politics of the United States, making big contributions, making the parties, the candidates, the think tanks dependent on the money that they dole out for whatever they believe in. But it's now another step in which the billionaires, having taken over the economy and control the politics, now want to control the media, the mass media, the way we get and process information. They want to control that too. Let me ask you whether it's reasonable for the media we rely on, for the news, how we know what's going on in our communities, across the country, in the world. We are left in this society to depend on whatever it is billionaires decide we will hear or see or read. The qualifications of the people making those decisions seem to be the billions that they earned in this topsy-turvy economic system. Here are the kinds of embarrassing questions this raises. Last week, President Obama gave a speech. He chose as the place he would give the speech an Amazon warehouse in Tennessee. Question: was he aware that choosing this place was a lovely piece of advertising for the company whose president just bought the newspaper upon which Mr. Obama depends in Washington? I don't know, but it is a question. Over recent weeks, there have been huge demonstrations by a major trade union in Germany, the Verdi, against Amazon for the wages and working conditions it is trying to impose on German workers. I wonder how the Washington Post will cover that event now that it's owned by the man who likewise owns and operates the company that is the target of those strikes. Last point. Amazon has come into a lot of criticism over recent years for the huge number of people to whom it pays, here we go now, $11 an hour. The average wage in the United States is $23 an hour. In other words, Amazon is a pioneer in paying large numbers of its employees in the United States less than half the average wage. $11 an hour, 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, puts you into poverty level in the United States, below the official poverty line. Do we want our newspapers to be controlled by people with that kind of a record, whose money comes from that kind of behavior? Interesting how our capitalist economic system works out who controls the media. Let me turn next to the jobs report that was released also last week. At first flush, you might have thought it was good news. How do I mean good news? Well, I mean something like this. 162,000 new jobs added. That's right, 162,000 new jobs in the month of July 2013. Now let's take a look at it. First of all, 162,000 jobs is not enough jobs even to give jobs to the people newly entering the labor market in that month. In other words, we don't even have enough jobs for the people who are young people just entering. And therefore, we surely do not have enough jobs to make even the slightest dent in the unemployment situation in this country. It's just not enough jobs. But that's the least of it. Let's take a look at what those jobs were. Ready? 65% of the jobs added in July were part-time jobs. That's right. 2/3 were part-time jobs. People don't need part-time jobs. They need full-time jobs. But we can't provide those. Only 1/3 of the jobs added in July, and they weren't enough to do anything about unemployment, were for full-time. 2/3 were for part-time. Here's another statistic. 61% of the jobs were in low-pay situations. Retail, hospitality, restaurants, that kind of job. In other words, 2/3 of the jobs were part-time and almost 2/3 were low-pay. We're not solving our unemployment problem, and the way we're keeping even some people working is by giving them the worst jobs that are available in our kind of economy. And the last fact of the jobs report is that hourly wages fell by 2 cents an hour. Now, that's not a big drop, I'll give you that. But it's a drop. It means that American workers had less to spend fewer goods and services to buy at the end of July compared to what they had at the end of June. That's not going to improve our economy. That's not going to bring a recovery. That's bad news, and it should have been presented that way. It wasn't, and that's why we've covered it here in the way it ought to have been covered today. The third short update before I introduce our guest for today has to do with the country of Spain in Europe. This is a country that has suffered and is still suffering a massive collapse of its banks and its housing sector, much worse even than what we have in the United States. Vast part of its industry cannot work. It has among the highest unemployment rates in all of Europe, currently measured over 27%. In the height of the Great Depression of the 1930s, the unemployment rate in the United States didn't get that bad. That's how bad things are in Spain. So they called in the International Monetary Fund, a major international banking institution, to give advice as to what they should do to get out of the terrible economic crisis that Spain has been suffering now for years. And here were the suggestions of the international bankers gathered at the International Monetary Fund. Number one, and the one I want you all to think about, cut wages by 10%. That's right. In a country suffering already 27% unemployment, a disaster of an economy, what bankers can think of is cutting wages by 10%. And as if that weren't enough, they also suggest, and I'm not making this up, raising the basic sales tax. It's called in Europe a VAT, value added tax. It's like a sales tax. Because they want the government's finances to be improved, and they will be improved by raising taxes on who? Value-added taxes fall on everyone. The average citizen in Spain will be paying more, while the average citizen is supposed to get 10% less wages. What? And here's the argument. If we cut wages, corporations will hire more people. That's right. The way you get out of a collapsed economy, collapsed because of what corporations did, banks, construction companies, all the major players in the Spanish economy. The way you get out of the crisis they produced is by cutting wages, raising taxes, and thanking the corporations for hopefully hiring more people now that you've cut the wages. So the real burden and the real hurt comes on the mass of people. Nothing is asked of the corporations other than to hire the people whose wages you've cut. This is not justice. This is not reasonable. This is outrageous. It's a proposal to improve the conditions in Spain by not costing those who caused the collapse, and indeed by rewarding them with lower wages imposed on the people who've already suffered and who had no role in bringing the crisis. Extraordinary what those in charge of today's capitalist countries have the nerve to propose. Our final short update has to do with a bill introduced in the United States Senate. And most of you will know that I don't talk much about the bills introduced in the United States Senate, because they're usually not that interesting, let alone progressive. But here's an unusual one. It's called Senate Bill 1746, 1746, for those of you that are interested. It was introduced by Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat of Connecticut, and by Senator Jack Reed, Democrat of Rhode Island. And here's what it says. Corporations should no longer be able to deduct from their taxes the costs of paying their executives over $1 million a year. Let me explain. Currently, under the law, the more money a corporation pays to its top executives, the more it can deduct from its taxes. That's right. If you pay your top executives $10, $15, $20 million, every one of those $10, $15, or $20 million, you can deduct from your profits as a corporation, and that will reduce your taxes. If corporations are paying to the federal and state governments, say in the neighborhood of 45% of their profits, it means that 45% of what they pay their executives, they'll get back in reduced taxes. It's as simple as that. We, in fact, we the taxpayers, have to make up for the money that the big corporations don't have to pay because they give their top executives high salary. That's called giving a company an incentive to overpay its top executives, which is one of the reasons why they do. And here are two senators who say, enough is enough. Let them deduct the first $1 million they pay to their executives, but not more than that. The bill is given no chance of passage from those people who pay attention, but it is important to note that there are at least some senators in the United States who are able to see gross injustice and try to do at least something about it. Okay, folks, it's time for me to introduce my guest. And I want to do that. He is Professor Joerg Rieger, and I want to tell you a little bit about him before we launch into our conversation today. He is the Wendland Cook Professor of Constructive Theology at the Perkins School of Theology, Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. For more than 2 decades, he has worked to bring together theology and the struggles for justice and liberation that mark our age. He is internationally recognized for his prolific and visionary writing. I'm going to mention 3 of his many books because I think those would be particularly interesting for folks who listen to this program. The first one is called Occupy Religion, Theology of the Multitude, published in 2012 with Kwok Pui Lan, and it is coming out in paperback over the next few weeks. The second one is called No Rising Tide, Theology, Economics, and the Future. And the final one, which is coming out later this year, is called Religion, Theology, and Class, Fresh Engagements After a Long Silence. And I think you'll understand more about that as we talk. Professor Rieger has lectured throughout the United States as well as internationally in South Africa, Senegal, Germany, Switzerland, England, Russia. The list goes on. He's active in his community in Dallas, Texas. And for those of you that might want to pursue his writings, you can find him on the web at joergrieger.com, and I'm going to spell it now, JOERGRIEGER, joergrieger.com. Joerg, an old friend, glad to be talking with you. Let's begin.
Thank you.
Let's begin. You've been writing recently about class differences, class structures, class conflicts. And I want to ask you, how do you see Christianity dealing with this question of class? Have Christians in their thinking changed their attitudes about class? And if so, how? What is the relationship between Christianity as a religion on the one hand and the class differences and class issues in modern society?
That is a very good question, Rick. The truth is, class is always there. It's always something that we have to deal with in our lives, and that's true for today as well as in ancient history. Class sometimes changes, the structures are different, but there's something that you find in the Jewish and the Christian traditions from the very beginning, and that is that the founders of these religions very often stayed close to what was considered the lower classes. So you go back all the way, to the Hebrew Bible. You find Moses, who we understand is one of the important founders of the Jewish religion, being there working not with the powerful, but ultimately with the Hebrew slaves. This is something That's surprising because Moses was raised at the Pharaoh's court. He was somebody who actually was raised upper class. And at one point, the old stories talk about Moses stepping out into the streets, seeing one of the Hebrew slaves or the slaves mistreated by the masters. And all of a sudden he realizes there is something wrong with that. He overreacts. He has to go into exile. But later on, when he hears God talking from the burning bush, God says, I have heard the cry of my people. So God self then at that point understands there is something happening with the working class of these days. And the announcement is, we will liberate them from their plight. So that's an ancient story. But in Jesus' times, you find the same thing. Jesus growing up as a construction worker, basically a day laborer today, staying with these folks all his life. When he made it to success, he didn't move up in the class structure, but he stayed with those people and he organized them. He led them to new ways of life. So that's the early beginnings of that religion. If you look at what happened in that time, from that time until now, you can say that, in some ways religion became successful and moved up in the class structure. But what's of interest to me is that there are always remnants. There's always examples of religion staying close to the lower classes, the working classes. Remembering Jesus' sayings that the last shall be the first, which also says that the first shall be the last. Yeah. So there's a reversal that goes through the ages, and that you can see, in the peasant wars in Europe, in the Middle Ages, in the 16th century. You can see that, in the U.S. history as well, where religion 100 years ago was very closely related to labor issues. And even the mainline churches very often paid attention to what was happening to the workers. There's a shift. I think this is what I'm getting at with this response to your first question. There's a shift today where I think in a common sense understanding people feel religion is not with the lower classes. Religion is something that defends the status quo and ultimately is something, that is on the side of the ruling classes. And this is a change, it seems to me, in religion that's not based on our traditions. That's because religion has become convenient for some of these groups to exploit. The paradox is that for a lot of people, they now think of traditional religion as part of the dominant interests. They think this is the way it always was. The conservatives use religion in that way, but that has nothing to do with any of our beginnings or with many points in history.
So would you say the following is reasonable? That religion, like so many other areas of modern society, is a place of conflict between alternative interpretations, alternative notions of what the basic commitments of the religious life and the religious teaching are. And so that in a sense that's being fought out, and people who are interested in religion are having to come to terms one way or another with the clash of opposing notions of what Christianity means and what Christianity's relationship is to class.
I think this is a very important point because if you look again at the history, I think conflict has been with us from the beginning. And conflict sometimes is healthy because it helps us understand what's real, what's not, what's important, what's unimportant. But in that conflict, today we have a sense as if the battle is always waged from the bottom up. When we hear the word class struggle, we're thinking of people, from the working class fighting everybody else. The reality is that a lot of this conflict was instigated from the top down in order, to either change the purposes of religion, make a buck, perhaps, economically, gain political power. All these things come together in this conflict. And so when now people resist and resent this conflict, people say, well, you're the ones who are waging class struggle. And so it kind of, the picture kind of shapes, picture kind of changes. Let me give you one example for that conflict that to me is just very fascinating. For Christians, one of the images of, an important religious figure that you see in many of the churches that's adored by many Christians over the world is Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now, there are certain things we know about Mary. There is one speech that she gives in the New Testament. This is in the Gospel of Luke, where she talks about how God has looked upon the lowliness of his servant, how he has considered her important, raised her up. But Mary goes on, this is in Luke chapter 1 for people who want to look this up. Mary then goes on and says, well, God lifts the lowliness of his servant, but at the same time he pushes the powerful from their thrones. So there's some conflict here where in this religion, in the Christian traditions, for instance, God self is part of the conflict. God's not just sitting at the top looking down saying, well, why can't we all get along? But God self says, well, there is something wrong here. God enters the struggle, lifting up the lowly, pushing the powerful from their thrones. Or at the end of her speech, Mary says, God fills the hungry with good things. Well, and all Christians can see the importance of that, God filling the hungry with good things. But the other part of that, second part of that sentence is, and sends the rich away empty. Now, that sounds like class struggle right there, but it's said about God. So God somehow is
involved in this.
Yes, exactly.
All right, let's take it to that point a little further. Over recent years, at least since 2007, the capitalist world, which means most of the world, has been mired in a very deep crisis. Hundreds of millions of people, if you add them up across the world, lost their job. Millions have been thrown out of their homes because they can't afford to stay anymore. Job security has been reduced. Benefits that go with working have been reduced. Public services have been cut by governments that are strapped for money. I mean, it's a really bad situation. How would you assess the response of religious institutions and organizations to a crisis that is so deep, lasting so long, and it is literally global in nature? Tell me how the religious community has responded in your mind.
I think perhaps you can assess the health of a religious community, religious institutions, by how they respond to those kinds of issues. I often say to my students, theology, the subject that I teach, is a matter of life and death. That's not to say theology is that important, but theology always deals with matters of life and death. And here, this is a matter of life and death. People are out of work, and people are dying from
Absolutely.
that. I mean, this is something that kills people. Now, the funny thing is that there's some religion that hasn't responded to that at all. You know, the gospel of prosperity keeps preaching the old prosperity message as if nothing has happened. The main line sometimes, doesn't ever go there. It doesn't touch economic issues. So some of that you find churches are not responding. At the same time, some of the people of conscience in religious areas have tried to help the affected people. They try to support people, open soup kitchens or support programs, charity work. Other churches have, helped people, help their own job search process, give them seminars, try to teach them what they might do as individuals to deal with those situations. None of these responses, it seems to me, are really helping the broader picture. Now, the reason I say that is because I also want to talk about the good things that are happening. And to me, this is, as not only a person teaching theology, but as a person of faith, this is where we need to look for the help of religion. So,
Joerg, let me interrupt you. We're going to take our normal mid-program break here. Please stay with us. I'm interviewing Joerg Rieger, and we come back in a very few moments to continue our discussion of how the religious community has responded to the crisis of the last 5 years as it sweeps across the globe. Economic Update. This is Richard Wolff, your host. I'm talking with Professor Joerg Rieger, professor from Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. And the question I was asking him that he was in the middle of responding to was, in a sense, he had talked about some of the shortcomings of how the religious community has responded to the deep economic crisis of the last 5.5 years, and now he wants to go on and tell us something about the kinds of responses he wished were more in evidence, but at least are happening somewhere to show the different ways that the religious community has responded.
Let me next talk about the most hopeful things that I can see, and that has to do with religious communities engaging issues of labor, because that economic crisis is not just a crisis of money, it's really a crisis of working people. People who are suffering are ultimately people who work. Many people who have lost their jobs, but even those who have kept their jobs are ultimately struggling. In that regard, you have budding movements that bring together religion and labor organizations. In my own place, Dallas, Texas, through an outfit called Jobs with Justice, we have organized religious communities to stand on the side of workers. We're actually, sometimes we have hearings, we invite working people to talk about what's going on, because this is the only way we can find out. These things are not reported in the Dallas Morning News or many of our other newspapers or news programs. So we find out what's happening in the world of labor from the people themselves, and we have hearings. We invite people of faith, and very often...
When you say we, who is the we here?
Well, this is, in Dallas, it's organized through Jobs with Justice, and then we have some religious leaders, some pastors, some theologians like myself, some key figures in other movements. And you know, this is a place, I'll get to that in a moment, where the Occupy Wall Street movement has also been very helpful, because it has helped people understand the difference between the 1% and the 99%. And so when we have these hearings as people of faith, religious leaders, academics, grassroots people as well, we have realized what's really going on. And then what we're doing is we're seeking the advice of the various groups. Sometimes it's a union that talks about what they need. Sometimes it's a community organization. Sometimes it's a group of workers that's not yet organized. But what we're assuming is that these issues are not the special interest issues of the individual workers. They're really community issues. And this is what we're beginning to understand. And in that situation, a couple of things happen. First of all, people become aware. Secondly, we become aware of our resources, of who we are, you know, what we can bring to the table. We become aware of the power of our religious traditions. That, you know, in the past, not just in the Bible, but throughout history, there have been people in similar situations. In Texas, there have been religious and labor movements. About 100 years ago, they had camp meetings. 10,000 people in a place would meet. Early 1900s in Texas, northeast Texas, southeastern Oklahoma. This is not something that anybody remembers, but we're now coming back to these traditions, and we're realizing there is something that's much bigger than just a social issue. So to me, that's one of the hopeful examples. And this is happening not just in Dallas, it's happening all over the country. Small coalitions of religion and labor that revitalize labor, but also revitalize religion, help us understand who we really are as people of faith.
Let me push you a little bit, Joerg. What would be your goal? What would you imagine? Let yourself go for a minute. What would you like to see a religious community, in your case, perhaps the Christian community of Dallas or of Texas, what would you like to see them be doing in the economic crisis we face, if you could somehow design the religious response? What would it be? What would it look like?
The first thing, since I'm a theologian, is to ask the question of God. Now, that may sound utterly pious to you as an economist, but let me explain what I mean.
Please.
The question of God in this situation is simply the question, where do we find God in this? And what I found over the years is the default assumption is always God is on top. Not only on top of the universe, not only on top of various religious structures, but God's also on top of the political structures, the economic structures, and so on. And so when a lot of religious people, Christians for sure, other religious people as well, pray to God, they look up. what I'm finding in these struggles, we're beginning to look around us. We're sometimes beginning to look down to the ground, and we're finding God there. So this is a religious revolution. It's call it a revival, but we're taking that term back now from the conservatives. Right. It's a religious understanding that what we're all about when we're talking about God is not up. It may be around us. It may be down. The God of Moses, the God of Jesus, the God of the prophets. And from that self-understanding emerges a whole new way of life. This is my vision for society that comes from that. Namely, now understanding that when we are together with our neighbors, working people who are struggling, we're now doing the sort of things that are in the midst of this struggle of life and death, supporting life. So the religious community puts itself squarely on the side of life. That means we have to move ourselves away from being on the side of death for so long. And the way you do that, that depends on what's necessary locally. You know, the most visible things, Occupy Wall Street, is people demonstrating, people making public statements. But the other things that I think grow out of that, you've seen this here with Occupy Wall Street, that then kind of transformed into Occupy Sandy and those kinds of. It now becomes something that revitalizes the community, that appreciates the contributions, not just of the high and mighty, but of the people to common life, that changes the culture, that changes relationships. So this is the broad dream, and this is not a utopian dream that can never happen. This is the sort of thing that's actually happening in these communities that I'm participating in.
So that's you'd like to see generalized?
I think it's already happening. So it's not Good. Something that I wish for, but what I can do as a theologian is simply pay attention and draw other people's attention to these grassroots communities where literally the grass is growing through the concrete in a way that we never thought was possible, and now it's happening. So this has nothing to do with narrow ideas of religion, the way we oftentimes use it, or narrow ideas even of morality. This is a whole new way of life that includes, what you do, where you shop, how you spend your time after work, but most importantly, what you do at work. That includes labor as a religious concern now.
Yes, what strikes me is it's an image of a Christian or a religious response to a crisis that says religious commitments, moral commitments, are the kind that should be involved not with keeping the system as it is, but with pushing for changes from below, and that the church isn't aligned with those who rule the society, but really is aligned with those who need and want the changes so that they're not excluded from how this society distributes its benefits.
Precisely, and that's what we've seen throughout history. That's what we're rediscovering now, that this is the way it has often worked. And in the history of the U.S., if you think about the sort of progress that we have made, it has very oftentimes been tied to grassroots movements supported by religious communities, whether that's abolitionism, the end of slavery, whether that's women's suffrage, whether that's the civil rights movement, or then the religious and labor movement that also goes back in history. You have many examples where this has already happened. So what we're saying is this is something that's about to happen again. It's beginning in certain places, and just watch it grow.
Okay. Let me take you in the time that we have remaining to perhaps a very difficult question to deal with, but one that I think is more and more inescapable. If we look at the way a standard capitalist enterprise works, it is organized such that all the key decisions are made by a very small group of people. The small group who are called major shareholders. That group of people who have huge blocks of shares that together give them the dominance among the ownership group. And they have, according to the law of American capitalism, they select, because you get one vote per share you own, they select the board of directors of any corporation, a group of 15 or 20 people, who have the legal right to decide what the enterprise produces, how it produces, what technology it uses, where it produces, whether in Cincinnati or in Shanghai, China. And finally, they're the group who decide what to do with the profits that are made by all the people working together. So a tiny group of people have all the key decisions, and the mass of people not only are excluded from those decisions, but are required to live with the consequences of the decisions they're excluded from. So the board of directors can decide to close the factory and move to China. It can decide to use the profit to pay gargantuan salaries to the executives. It can, et cetera, et cetera. How does the religious community accept, criticize, or maybe use a more general term, how do they deal with something as patently undemocratic and likely by most standards of justice to be called unjust? Doesn't that present a problem and a demand for some sort of moral, ethical, and religious response? How do you deal with that?
The truth is that for a lot of us, it really does present a problem, like you're just saying. But the interesting question for me is, why does it not present a problem for so many other people of faith? And there, again, people may be wondering why, as a theologian, I'm working on issues of theology, economics, power. It is precisely because for a lot of people, their understanding of God is like what you just described. When they think of God, they think of a all-powerful CEO who's working from the top down, who's making things happen, who produces all things, and therefore I think they have very little questions that they could raise of that system. But what I'm saying is this is really a misunderstanding of God in many of our religious traditions. Certainly in Christianity, I can say that as a Christian theologian, Judaism, Islam as well, Buddhism perhaps, which doesn't talk as much about God, but which talks a lot about equality. So the misunderstanding is this: we're basically, again, looking up when we think about God. Or for Christians, when they say Jesus is Lord, they basically assume that a Lord is something like a CEO. While in reality, if you think about what the early Christian confessions meant that Jesus is Lord, they really meant Jesus is Lord unlike any other Lord that you knew. Jesus is Lord unlike the Roman Emperor. Or today we might have to say Jesus is Lord unlike a CEO. And so at that point, there's a theological assumption here where people don't question the system, the hierarchical system, because they think religion demands it. What we're saying, and what's based on, I think, our religious traditions, it may actually be the other way around. Religion may demand a more democratic system. God, Jesus as Lord, to use that one example, may actually demand a more egalitarian relationship because Jesus' Lordship. People who know the New Testament remember he lived this not as a boss, but really as a worker, as a service worker in that regard, as a peasant perhaps. But certainly never as the king, never as what we understand as top-down. So it really depends on how you look at the Christian theological universe and other theological universes where you identify God. So again, the God question here is utterly important because this is what fuels all of these problems as far as I'm concerned. And so here, where I can help, helping our religious folk understand that what we're worshiping, when we worship the top, may ultimately be the idol, the old golden calf, a power that was rejected by Jesus many times. One prominent time when he was led by the devil, these stories of the temptation of Jesus in the beginning of the Gospels, he was led by the devil on a high mountain, and the devil said, well, you can have all the power over the world if you want. And Jesus says no. It basically rejects that top-down power and never comes back to reclaim it. That's not to say that we're giving up power here, but we're embracing a power that's a lot more democratic. Or as some of my colleagues and I in the Occupy Religion book are saying, this is a power that's laocratic. Ochlocratic. Those are the Greek terms. So in the Greek system, the demos was the elite citizenship of a polis, of a town, of a city-state. The laos were the common people, The oiklos were even below that, the multitude, the people that nobody pays attention to. So we're talking about not only democracy where the elite citizens now run the show, which is certainly better than a monarchy or plutocracy or any of that. But we're talking about laocracy where the people rule, ochlocracy where the multitude, working people, the 99% ultimately rule. And that is a whole new vision. So religion here is not in the defensive. It might actually help us in our imaginary develop some ideas as to how what you're working towards might look like, and how that has actually been practiced in some other times in history.
Well, we've run out of time, as we always do, but I cannot resist making a comment on what you have told us today, Joerg, because imagine with me, those of you that are participating in this program, what would happen to American politics, to the Republicans and the Democrats, if the kinds of Christian belief and commitment you've just heard articulated here began to be the prevalent one among Christians in the United States? It would change the whole direction of the United States as a society, and it would change the lives of every single person, not only in this country, but in the whole world, given the power of the United States. So this is no minor matter, this question of how a Christian deals with the economic realities of our time. So thank you very much again for coming and spending some time with us.
And thank you, Rick. I enjoyed being on the program. I greatly appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thank you very much. Okay, in the time we have left, I want to respond to a person who wrote to me with some indignation. The person said, I want you to talk about Gayle McLaughlin. And I had to look it up because it wasn't in my head. I had to say, who is Gayle McLaughlin? And then I remembered, and I quickly did my research. So I want to respond to that listener by saying, first of all, you're quite right. I should have been talking even more. It turns out I did mention her name in an earlier program, but I want to come back and I want to talk about this remarkable woman. She is the mayor of a town in California, an important town, small city you might say, Richmond, California, in what is called the Bay Area around San Francisco. It's a blue-collar city, has about 100,000 people living in it, and it is, how shall I put this politely, it is dominated by one enormous employer, the Chevron Corporation, a major oil company here in the United States. And partly because of its working-class nature, and partly because of the crisis that has engulfed the American working class, it is also a town where a great number of people have found that they could not maintain their mortgages, partly because of unemployment that hit in that area of California. They lost their jobs, which made it impossible to maintain their mortgage payments. Make a long story short, many of the houses in Richmond, California, are worth less than the debts of the people who are still living in them to the banks they borrowed from to buy those houses. But here is an unusual mayor. She is not presiding over a resigned population. She is not accepting the immense costs of foreclosed homes, of unemployed citizens, and of a of an industry, Chevron, that has done major damage to Richmond and its people for a long time. She fights back, together with interested citizens who are newly discovering what it means to have a mayor who's actually on your side, to have a politician who isn't all words, doesn't just show up 3 weeks before the election to do the usual song and dance. No. She's a fighter. And she's done two things that are extraordinary. First, she went after the company. She did not bow down, as politicians usually do, to the dominant employers in the area by doing what they want. So the first thing she did was to deal with the enormous explosion and fire that happened on August 6, 2012. It happened on the Chevron property. It happened because of Chevron's behavior. Toxic smoke. More than 15,000 people in the Richmond area sought emergency room care. We're talking a major disaster. The U.S. Chemical Safety Board uncovered evidence that more than a decade ago, Chevron's own engineers recommended repair work on the pipe that corroded. Chevron says it paid $10 million to help local hospitals deal with the 24,000 claims against them. But Mayor McLaughlin says the costs are much larger and the company ought to pay way more than all of that. And she's fighting in court and in the court of public opinion and with demonstrations and with getting the support of all kinds of communities. They're not done with Chevron. It isn't going to be able to get away with the damage the explosion cost without paying at least a fair share of the costs of coping with the results for the health and others problems caused by that employer. These are people who are demanding a better deal and are finding the political leadership to get it. They're not resigned. They're not sheep. They're proud Americans who are making the rest of us prouder by seeing what a fighting population can do, even against a multi-billion-dollar behemoth like Chevron. But it's not enough. Mayor Gayle McLaughlin of Richmond, California, is equally famous because she is devising new ways to use the existing laws to help her people and to work with those people. She's the mayor, this is what I referred to in an earlier program, who is making use of the right of eminent domain, the legal provision in American law that any political authority, a city, a state, federal government, can require a private owner of property to sell that property if it's in the interests of the broader benefit of the community. You might have heard about that in the life of George Bush, the last Bush president, who was able to get Texas authorities to use eminent domain to help build up the stadium for the team that he owned. And there are many other examples. But here comes Mayor McLaughlin and says, I have a new use. I'm going to use the power of eminent domain to buy the homes currently owned by banks and lenders at the real price that they're worth, which isn't much, much less than the debts of the people who are still living in them. And after I do that, I'm going to sell it back to those people at a fraction of its cost. It's the equivalent of a bank writing down the debt that a mortgaged owner has to pay, admitting that the value of the property has dropped and cutting the mortgage debt owed by an equivalent amount. That's what this would achieve. That's, by the way, what President Obama's promised to help mortgage folks in difficulty. That's what it was supposed to do, reduce the outstanding debt of houses that had fallen in value through no fault of the people living in them because of unemployment and a depressed economy. But here's a mayor, unlike our president, who isn't just saying, I'm going to do this, I want to do this, I think we ought to do this, and it doesn't get done for most of the Americans it was supposed to help. Here's a mayor who fights. She's in the courts. She will not be stopped by the lawyers sent in by the banks to stop all of this, fearful that the use of eminent domain in Richmond, California could spread across the United States and become a plan other mayors, pushed from below by their people, might turn to. This is a courageous politician, and I agree with the listener who sent me the demand that I talk about her. He's right. I should have, and I hope I've made up for it. If you can, pay some attention to Gayle McLaughlin, mayor of Richmond, California. Not the least of her achievements, and this is my closing comment, has to do with her cooperation with her chief of police. And I want to mention his name because I found it so remarkable. If I can find it here in my... Yes, Chris Magnus, chief of the Richmond police, who understands that the people who are demonstrating outside of Chevron to make their point about getting restitution from that corporation for the damage done, that when the police come and these folks are arrested, as they want to be, to make their case as strong and dramatic as possible, that he treats these people with the respect they deserve for the courageous civic action they're engaged in, and that he treats them carefully, and that after he's arrested them and the process is done, he releases them, because he knows, as any good policeman should, that not only are these folks no threat to the public well-being, on the contrary, they're heroes and should be given what heroes are due. There's a mayor and there's a police chief, part of the United States, about whom we don't hear anywhere near enough. There are people fighting back, and they're doing real well. Thank you. This is Richard Wolff. This is Economic Update, and I look forward to talking with you again next week.